Alright, I've got most of the paint work done, so it's time to get to weathering this Rogal Dorn Battle Tank. Now, if you didn't see the video about getting the base paints on, you can check it out from this link right up here and catch up with where things are. Now, the first step will be wrangling these tracks in there, and I'll just get that slid in place, go around and glue all of them on, and get the tracks mounted on there because I want to do all the weathering together. So let me take a few minutes to do that, and we'll move on. The model comes with a really good decal sheet, so let me get a few of those on. I'll put a little micro set in place where I want the decal. I'll carefully position the decal. Work out any air bubbles from behind it with this Q-tip. Then once I have the other decal I wanted to put in that area in place, I'll just take some Solva set and put that over the decals and let it be. Don't want to mess with it at that point. I like Solva set better than I like Micro Sol because it's a little hotter, and I think it does a little better job of softening the decal up, making it conform to the surface. All right, the next thing I want to do is chipping, and I think when it comes to chipping, less is more. You can sell a vehicle as very chipped without having to put that many chips on it, I think. And part of the way I've done this on this particular model is by the way that I dry brushed it from the very beginning. That looks worn, that looks chipped. So I can go in and just begin adding a few larger chips, and it's really going to sell as a heavily chipped vehicle. When if you just are really looking at the work that's done there now, all I've done is some paint distressing, but it sells chipping to the brain. So adding in some additional colors, a few additional places, is really going to push that notion of a heavily chipped vehicle without necessarily a lot of work. Now on this model, I'm going to go for a two-color chipping scheme. I'm going to use a lighter gray color to indicate chips that go down into the paint, scuffs and things like that, but not all the way to the underlying surface material. Then I'll use a darker color to represent the material underneath. Now I'm going to use a brownish color, a dark brown color, which will indicate a ferrous metal. Ferrous metals are metals that are made of ferrets. Not really, but it's going to indicate a ferrous metal underneath, but indicating some kind of rust or corrosion or something like that. If you want to make it look like it's a composite, say a dark gray would work better. If it's wood, some browns that are more woodish will look good. So just keep in mind what the material underneath is when you're picking your colors. Now for this, I'm going to use Althu and gray, just because it's lighter than what's already there. It'll make some good scuffs and scrapes and things like that. And then I'm going to use this German camo black brown. It's a very good color for showing metallic chipping underneath a paint scheme. Now the tools that I'm going to use a sponge, and this is a very tight sponge pattern. You can see that I got this from some packing foam that comes in boxes of fruit that we get from a company called Harry and David. They have really good pears. I like their pears. I use these clamps to hold it, and what I like to do is I like to fold this in half so I get an edge like that, and then I hold it in the clamps. Now I like using the clamps because it allows me to be more precise, I think, because when I'm using my fingers, it's harder to see. My fingers run into things. With this, I'm able to be more precise, use it more like a brush. I mean, imagine trying to paint. If you're trying to paint, instead of holding it here, you're having to hold it way up here. That's essentially the same thing. So I like using these clamps like this. Tweezers work fine. I just like this because I can clamp it in there and I don't have to grip it really hard. And then I'm going to be using this This is a Series 93 brush from Rosemary & Co. You could also use a Series 33 or 323 if you're using Rosemary & Co. brushes. But what this is it's just a shorter brush with a very fine point, size 0. And it doesn't have as much flex as a longer round brush. And this is going to allow me to do more fine chipping, because what I find easiest is to do a little bit of sponge chipping and then go in and enhance it with the lighter gray with the brush, doing some streaks and joining some things together and making some shapes, and then going in here with the dark color after that and just painting in some areas where it has gone all the way through. And you don't have to do a lot, just a little will sell it. But that's kind of the theory and the tools that I'm going to be using. So let me get started. Now I've thinned my paint with water, probably about 2 parts paint, 1 part water, maybe not quite that much. But I'm going to start off with my sponge chipping. Now I'm only very lightly touching it, and what I'm looking for is areas that would receive the most wear and tear. So lower down on the tank, of course, is going to receive more, because this is where it's going to run into buildings and trees, and shrapnel is going to be flying up. There's going to be all sorts of things happening like that. Also, the crew will walk on the surface of the tank. If you're going to get in the tank, you've got to climb up on the tank. If you're going to service the engine, you've got to walk on the back of it. So there's walking patterns. So I try to think in terms of there's going to be more weathering down low than up high. And so I try to distribute the chipping that way. Now I just start with this lighter chipping. You'll notice I could really go to town on it. And you can do that. Like if there's an area that you think, okay, this needs to be heavily chipped, you can really go to town on it. Now, I do slightly rotate the sponge as I'm doing it to give it kind of a variation, but I don't worry about it too much, because once I start adding in some brush chipping and other things, and I put multiple layers of this on, it's going to randomize it. Now, if you see that your stuff is getting very potato stampy looking, then it's probably not a bad idea to rotate your sponge around just a little bit. But I'm going to go around and just do this all across the tank, getting into chipping. And I recommend doing it lighter rather than heavier. And then after you've done a kind of a pass of it, just sit back and look at it and see, is that what I want? Knowing that there's going to be some brush work to come. There's going to be some darker chipping to come. So those are all important. Don't forget to chip over your decals. Those are going to get chipped, whether it's paint or whether it's a sticker or something like that. Now I'm still working on the sponge chipping around the full model, but I wanted to go ahead and focus on the painted chips in one area just to demonstrate those. It makes it easier to video. But what I'm doing is I'm taking the same paint that I've been using for the sponge chipping at the same consistency, and I'm using this. This is a Rosemary & Co. size 0 Series 93 brush. It's a very short brush. The thickness is about the same as your typical round brush, but it's much shorter, so the bristles are just a little stiffer. It's got a very nice point on it. And all I want to do here is just go into a few areas where I want there to be heavier chipping. And what I'll do is I'll paint in additional chips. I'll just kind of join an area, because I'm thinking this area right here would get a lot more chipping because of, mud and dirt and things that might cling to the tracks when they hit this overhang right here would get more chipping. Now, you can do chipping entirely with a brush without a sponge. If you've ever watched Martin Kovach on night shift scale models, you'll see that he does that. You can get very fine chips in like that. But I just find that it's a time saver to use the sponge. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work this to be a little bigger, knowing that I'm going to put in darker paint in the middle of this. So that's what I'm taking into account as I do this, that there's going to be darker paint. You don't have to do that, of course, but that's what my thinking is. Now, I also use the brush, and I'll do, even though I'm doing it out of order for the video, I'll do all of the sponge chipping, then I'll go in and do all of this brush chipping with the lighter color, then I'll go in and do all of it with the darker color. But as I'm working it, I always think about, okay, what's going to be the next step? I also think about what's going to be the steps after the chipping, because there's going to be dirt, there's going to be mud effects, grease and oil stain effects going all over the model. And so I think about how will those stand up to that? So like in this area, I want there to be visible enough chipping that once I start putting on mud and dirt effects, that some of it will show through, because I know I'm going to lose some of this. So you have to think about that resolution of finish, I guess you would say. So I'm going to put those on like that. But I can also use this, I think it looks good like in open areas like this, to just do some light streaks and things like that. Not a lot of them. You can. I just like to put in a few like that. Sometimes I like the look of, instead of a straight line, just kind of a jagged like that. Something that just indicates where something scrapes along, but, maybe kind of like bounces against it because there's other forces involved, other factors involved. And I tend to, on the side of the tank, make them more in the direction of travel, because to me that just makes sense. But at the same time, I might draw one that comes down like this because maybe, a crewman dropped a wrench and it hit the side of it like that, or whatever, something fell from above. So, but just adding in areas like that, you don't have to do it all over, but just a few areas where you make it a little bigger, a little more dramatic, is going to help sell the notion of a very used armor thing. Now for the darker chips, I'm going to switch to this German camo black brown. And I'm just going to begin applying that in those lighter areas. Now generally I'm going to confine it to be within the areas that I've done in the lighter paint, because I want it to seem like there's a larger scratch, a larger thing happening that's gone right down to the underlying material. Now, this is also a great place that when we're doing later weathering, I may add some rust stains to each of these areas, because by using this color, I'm indicating that there's some kind of corrosion, some kind of rust going on there. So you can help sell that with additional rusting. You don't necessarily have to make it into a rust bucket, but vehicles in Warhammer 40K are very old. So showing some rust that way is perfectly fine. And then in some areas, I'll just come in here and paint into the middle of the scratches that I've done. You don't have to fully fill it in. Fully fill it. Anyway, it's early in the morning. I'm kind of tired. I'll just put that in like that. Now, the paint is thinned enough so that I can get on and get opaque coverage generally in one coat. But it's thin enough that it's not going to leave texture. In other words, if it looks like texture, remember there's two kinds of texture we can paint onto a model. There's visual texture and there's visceral texture. Visual texture is texture where you're using paint to simulate texture, and it looks that way. If that's what you're going for, that's fine. And I think in the chipping process, that's not a bad thing. But we want it to be thin enough so that it's not leaving a visceral texture that you can feel. I think there's times for that. If you ever modeled machining Krieger, you know the benefit of having visceral texture. But I think when you're chipping, you want it to be a little smoother, so it's thin enough to not leave a texture, but thick enough to be opaque. You can also pick some areas where you can say, well, you know what, there's going to be this chip, this streak there that goes right down to the underlying material. No light area around it. So you can do that. Remember, it's your model. You do it how you want. If you want to paint the dark stuff first and then put the light around it, do it. If you want to use just one color or the other, do it. Whatever you think is going to look good and work for the goal that you're trying to achieve. So I'm going to continue doing this on up until I have to leave and go to work, and then I'll head to work, enjoy a nice breakfast at Biscuitville, and then come home and later today continue doing this for quite a few hours. All right, I've got all the chipping done. Now I want to start just doing various earth effects, fluid stains, things like that. Now, normally when I do this, I start with the stain type of stuff first, whether it's earth kind of staining such as mud or other environmental staining. In other words, things from the outside getting onto the tank. And then I also put on some, oil spills, oil stains, fuel stains, coffee stains, things like that. So that's kind of the next step, but it doesn't all have to be in a specific order. You can do a little of one, a little of the other, layer them over each other. The more you layer things, the more you get a depth of finish that I think really contributes to the realism and just the look of the model. Now I'm depicting this tank as operating in a urban waste environment. Think large city where there's been a lot of fighting, a lot of buildings knocked down, a lot of concrete blown up, not a lot of dirt, mud, those kind of things. A lot more light color, cold colors. Not that there can't be some mud and things like that, because obviously underneath all of the concrete and the building material and all of that, there's dirt. But I really want to sell the idea of this urban wasteland theme. So I'm going to keep most of the weathering colors in the cooler tones, grays, blues, things like that, just for, the streaking and stuff. Now I like to use these Vallejo model washes. They're really convenient, really easy to use, but you can use thin down paints. You can of course use oils and enamels. You can use whatever you want. But I like these because they go on very easily, and they dry fairly quickly, and they're just really convenient. But let's say all you had was just some Citadel or Vallejo paint. You could thin those down with some water, some Lamian medium, some kind of thinning medium, just to thin them down and just streak them on in basically the same manner that I'm going to show you here. And if you're not sure how to work, find a spare model or flip the model over on the bottom and test it there and see if it does what you want. Now the way I like to use these Vallejo washes, and this can go for any thinned paint really, is I just get a bunch loaded up on this cheap liner brush and I just start flicking it down. Now obviously when you first apply it, the first brush load is going to be fairly heavy. So I go ahead and get that in there like that, but then I go to other areas, and as the brush gets unloaded, I just continue putting in streaks like that. And when I feel like I've unloaded most of it off the brush, I go back to the palette, get some more on, and continue in another area with the full load. So in that way, I build up heavier streaks and lighter streaks all across the surface. Now, generally weathering is random. I mean, there's going to be some things that aren't random, and that, you know, if a tank drives through the mud, there's going to be mud in most places on the tank. But it doesn't have to be equal on each side. It doesn't have to be equal on every part. There can be areas that are cleaner than others. You know, you could get streaks in one area, but then maybe, you know, there's somebody's come along and they've dumped some water over the side and it's washed away some of it. Or they ran over a fire hydrant and it, you know, fired water up from the bottom. So there's a lot of ways to look at how the weathering goes on. But as I put this on, after I put those initial streaks in, I start thinking, okay, let's make it heavier towards the bottom. Because, you know, as we all know, stuff runs downhill, right? So I put it on. The first pass was going from the top to the bottom. Then now it's more about, 3/4 down, half down. Again, it doesn't have to be precise. You're just wanting randomization. You're wanting streaks. You're wanting, this is representing mostly rain and dust marks. So, and this is the Vallejo gray wash. Now I'll use some of this blue gray, but I'll use it very sparingly, because if I use too much of this, it's just going to end up looking like, well, blue streaks. But I will use a little bit of it. But another thing I do towards the bottom is I just start stippling like that. And I just put some on, stipple it around. And this stuff dries fairly quick. It's very flowy, very watery. So I let it go on there, stipple it on like that, let it dry. And just keep building it up. I can move around and work on the front of the model. And, you know, the other side, sides of the turrets, things like that. Now, I like to do the lower part of the model first to kind of establish how the heaviest weathering is going to be. And then everything else above that is lighter in terms of whether it's streaking or mud or anything like that. So that's how I like to do it. But you may decide you want to do the upper surfaces first and then go heavier as you go down. Somebody else may decide they want the whole thing to be equally muddy. It's your model. You do what you think looks cool. I mean, especially with Warhammer. You know, I understand if you're building, you know, a German tank from the Eastern Front in 1943 and you've got a specific picture that you're trying to make it look like a specific thing. This is all make-believe. Sorry, didn't mean to, you know, break it so severely there, but this is all make-believe. Whatever you think is cool, do it. You know, if the guy that you game with says that that's not how this tank would be in the 41st century, just tell him that's how your tank is in the 41st century, because you're both right. Now, once I've started getting that base streaking down, kind of forming the first layer of the weathering, I start adding in other kind of stainings. And like I was saying earlier, I think, if I remember correctly, these don't necessarily have to be in any particular order, because if you think about weathering, a tank could go out, it drives around, there's going to be dust that collects on it. Maybe it rains, it gets streaks, it comes back to wherever it's operating from, it gets refueled, they spill some fuel on it, spill some oil, it goes back out. All of that stuff happens over again, collects onto where the fuel and the other stains are. Maybe now, because it's been wet for a few days, maybe there's some parts on it that start rusting and you have just the very beginnings of rust, and you do that cycle over and over and over again. Things layer up. Things are underneath a lot of layers. Some things are on top of a lot of layers. So it really helps that depth of finish to just kind of put some stuff on, let it dry, put some other stuff on, put some other stuff on over it, put two different things on together and let them kind of mix together. Anything that's going to sell the notion that this is a worn, used military vehicle is going to work pretty well. Now, when it comes to the other fluid stainings that I've talked about, these are some of the things that I use, and these are acrylics. Again, I'm not even addressing enamels or oils, which are obviously great weathering products also. But for example, I like some of these from Vallejo. This is a fuel stains, which is a dark brown. And then this is oil stains, which is more of a very black brown, but it's mostly when it's on the model, it's black. Now, those are gloss. Wet stains are going to be glossy. You can also use Citadel shades because this color is very similar to this color, and this color is very similar to this. Now, these are the matte versions of their shades, so I can mix and match these. So these can form the basis for, say, fuel stains or oil stains or something like that, and they'll dry matte. And then I can do a later layer of the glossy staining, and that will look like a fresh oil leak or fuel leak or something like that. And you can use other colors. You know, there can be reds, there can be greens, there can be just about any color, any kind of fluid is going to have slightly different color. And remember, this is the 41st century. If somebody says, hey, I've never heard of purple fluid before, you know, purple engine fluid, say, oh yeah, that's what they use in the 41st century. So there's a lot of options for doing that. Also, with rust, anything ranging from a dark orange-brown to a yellowish orange will work just fine. There's Vallejo washes that are rust colors. Scrag Brown from Citadel. It's a layer paint. When thinned down, makes a very nice rust color. And all of those things can be used together to just give depth and age to the model, and just add some elements to it that are really nice. And as far as how much you think is right, it's up to you. A little bit goes a long way in a lot of cases, but sometimes maybe you really want to sell that this is a rusty thing, so you may use more of that. Maybe you want to show something that really had a bad oil stain. So you really want to feature a lot of oil. An example I've used in a few videos is back during World War II, there's a very famous picture of a P-47 Thunderbolt that came back from a mission. Its oil line had been hit somehow in combat, and it sprayed oil down one side of the aircraft. One entire side of the aircraft was completely stained in oil. And there's some very famous pictures of it, and it was a mess, you know. So you're not going out on a limb to put a lot of oil stains or a lot of rust or a lot of anything on a model. It's whatever you think looks cool. Now, by way of example, I want to add some fuel stains around these two, what I'm imagining to be fuel filler caps. And I've already shaded them and done some things to them just to kind of start the weathering. But I'm using some a Citadel shade, Agrax Earth Shade. And I'm going to put around here quite a bit. You know, if you ever go look at a vehicle that's really old, seen a lot of use, a truck, a tank, whatever, the fuel filler caps, unless you deliberately keep them clean, they get really dirty. They get sticky, and dirt and dust and other stuff gets stuck to it. And so they're going to be, you know, really kind of beat up looking. And the underlying layers, because they're going to have dirt and dust clinging to them, are going to be very matte. So this first layer that I put on with the Citadel shade, making sure to use the matte version, is going to be matte and looking rather dirty. And one trick I like doing, if you want to have a nice fuel stain, you can add some water like this. And that's just, I just dipped my brush in the water, didn't even clean it off, just added some to it. And you just put some of the wash right there, and you just kind of let it flow. Let it do its thing. That's exactly how it would do it in real life. And the water just helps it flow across the surface. That's all the water's doing. I can just leave that there and let it dry. And sometimes the best weathering is accidental weathering, serendipitous weathering, the weathering you weren't necessarily expecting. So let me let that dry, and then we'll add another layer to it. Now I've got those areas dried up. gave him a little encouragement with my hairdryer. And I could go back in with some Agrax Earthshade and add that over it, but to just kind of skip forward to the end, I'm going to show kind of what I would do with the final stage of creating fluid stains. And like I said, you can do this as many times, put dust stains over it, more fuel, dust stains, fuel. You can do it however you think is enough. But now I'm going to go to the Vallejo oil, fuel stains product. And I'm going to put this in. And this I'm going to stipple on just in a few areas like that. I'm going to do it right down the center of where I had that little spill. Because where fluids flow, they tend to encourage more fluid flow. So here I'm just going to stipple it on, because really what I'm going for here is it's got a slightly different color, but it's also glossy. So by adding just a little bit of gloss to it, it indicates more fresh fuel stains. Now, if you don't have a glossy kind of product like this, but you have some gloss medium, or even just some gloss floor polish like we use on our models sometimes, you can just add a little of that in, put it over it, and you've got your glossy look to it. So whatever you think it needs to be. Now, just to show that you can mix a lot of different products, I'm going to take some of this Vallejo Model Wash Rust color, and I'm going to mix one part of this, which is kind of a dark, more reddish, with this Scrag Brown, which is a little more desaturated, a little orangey. I'm going to mix the two of them together, and then water it heavily down with water. And you can see that it just forms something that looks about like that. And then all I'm going to do is go into these exhausts and just start applying it. Now initially I'm just going to put it all over and depend on that rust texture that I had already laid down there to kind of give some texture, to give some variation in the color. And I'll just put that on like that, let it dry. Then I can go in with the same mix or a lighter mix or a darker mix. I can stipple it on. I can put it on like a wash. I could take another color and just mix it in with these. You can do wet blending, dry brushing, pretty much anything you want to sell the notion of rust. Rust tends to get on things around it, so I'm going to put a little there as it goes on to this surface here. This would be a great color to put around some bolts here and there. Maybe they got some water down in them, and you just kind of stipple on that color. Let it do its thing. If you want to grab some water real quick, you can take some water, just blend that out as much as you want, or you can have it as prominent as you want. The trick is to just think about what is likely to happen in one specific area or another, and what colors would work there, and then just experiment. It's always best to put it on light and then go heavy. That way you can kind of control the application. But that's all I'm going to be doing on the rest of the model for all of these fluid stains. Whether it's rust, whether it's oil, radiator fluid. You know, it is the 41st century, and the grim, dark future, there's only war. And I hope ice cream, but at least there's only war. So, you know, put some blood stains on it. Whatever you think is going to work. Main thing is, have fun. Now for the mud and more visceral weathering effects, I'm going to use some Citadel Astro Granite. This is one of their technical paints. And it's basically just a paint with some texture in it. And I'm just going to put this on here fairly heavily, making sure to get up under there, like that. I'm going to start off right down here. Just kind of blob it on there like that. Lower down. Then I'm going to go over to my cup of water. And I'm going to clean off the brush, but I'm going to leave it loaded down with water. You can see how much water's on there. I'm just going to start blending this a little bit. Now, the goal is not so much to wash it all away, but to just blend it in, thin it down just a little, let it spread out, and then also just start picking it up. Now that it's kind of thinned down, pick it up and move it up the side of the model a little more to represent mud splashes and things like that. It's a very enjoyable process, I think. It's kind of like when we were kids, and well, at least I did. Liked playing in the mud. I remember when we made mud pies, stuff like that. That was back before video games. I'm going to do the same thing on the road wheels, get back into the track area. I'm going to keep it mostly off of the tracks. The thing about tracks that you have to think about is that they, in the process of the tank rolling along, they often get somewhat cleaned up. I mean, they're going to be dirty, they're going to be rusty, they're going to have, liquid on them. Oh, and by the way, you want to use an old synthetic brush for this. It gets pretty beat up in the process. But the tracks, they get fairly cleaned up as they roll around. Like on the bottoms, of course, they're rolling along the ground, and that's going to scrub off some things. As it comes around, hits the top of the fender, it's going to scrub some things off. Where the road wheels connect with the inner part of the track, that's going to do a certain amount of cleaning. So you're not going to see giant clumps of mud necessarily in there. I mean, it's going to pick some up as it rolls around, but they're going to fall off, get crushed. They're going to work their way out. So you don't necessarily have to have a huge amount of mud and other effects in the tracks. But it will get into these road wheels back in this area. Any place that's going to be moving around and scraping against surfaces is going to get more cleaned off. Things that are moving but aren't scraping against anything are going to get less cleaned off. So, and every now and then I'll wipe the brush off and go in here and just pick up some of that extra water. What I like to do on the road wheels is get them nice and dirty and then go back in and clean it off just a little so that a little bit of the detail shows. I want it to stay dirty, but if I get a little bit of the bolt detail and things like that showing through, that's about the level I like it. And then after this is dried a little bit, I go back and I just use the brush to do a little more spotting like that. See how it's just leaving like little splatters along there? That's how I like that to look. I'll let that dry and see what I think of it and go from there. And for the areas back here, I imagine, because you think about the tracks are going to move around this way. So when they come back here, that's where they're going to be picking up and carrying more mud. So there's going to be more mud deposits, more texture deposits back here than there would be necessarily up here, because by the time it travels under these fenders and through there, it's going to get some knocked off and it's going to drop off and it's going to come through here and be cleaner. Not clean, but cleaner. So this back here, I'm going to really go heavy on that and allow some of the texture to just really stay right in here. Now on the tracks themselves, be a little lighter, as I've talked about. That constant movement cleans them off, so I'll get some on there, but then I'll wet my brush down. And I'm going to go through, and I really just want more of the color to stain it somewhat. I don't necessarily need it to be muddy. I just want the color to stain it. But I want some of the rust to show through, some of the texture to show through, some of the previous work to show through. And you just keep working it until you get it like you want. If you find you take off too much, well, you go back later once it's dry and you add a little more in. Again, this is one of those things that you decide what looks right. This is your model, and you decide what looks right. There, I'll let that dry and see what I think about it. Now I just go around the rest of the model up on the front. I put some of this texture because it's going to drive through mud and it's going to get splashed up. And I'll put some on the back here. And not so much up at the top, because this is representing mud that gets thrown up onto the model, so, or onto the tank. So not so much up top here. Now putting on all that mud and textured effect will flatten the model out just a little bit. So I'm going to take, this is a mixture of the Vallejo Gray Model Wash and some Citadel Nuln Oil. And I'm not even sure what the ratio is. I just kept adding Nuln Oil into my palette that already had the Citadel Gray Wash and test applied it to find where it was dark enough that it would establish just a little bit of contrast. Again, this is, I think I said, I may not have, this is a more stylistic approach, but it just helps the features of the model come back out. When you apply that single color of mud, the Astro Granite, they just kind of disappear. And this just kind of helps them come back. It won't be too dark when it dries, but if somebody's looking at it, they'll see the details. Again, this is just, you put it on till you think it looks good. You may decide to skip this step, but I just think it adds a little bit of depth back to the model. And I'm actually putting this on while everything is still somewhat wet so that it blends in a little bit. All right, you can see how after that dries up, how that looks. I'm pretty happy with that. That's pretty much what I was going for. Not a massively dirty, you know, like it's been riding around in the mud out in the woods kind of look, but just something that's obviously used, obviously worn, yet you can still see most of the details and see how the features look. So I'm liking that. You can see up here on the front how I got that, and I never weather the bottom. I don't worry about it, but got that on there, and I may do a little more on the treads right along there just to tint those a little more. You can see here along the back, done kind of the same thing. So the last step is a step I take on every model, and that's to just go through and look at all of the things and pieces and parts and just finish stuff up. Like I need to finish up painting some of these little lenses here, the searchlights. I'm not going to show that. That's if you're watching this far, you probably already know how to do that, and I'm not going to show you anything that's special. 3 colors and some gloss, and you're good. But just touch up any weathering that I see that needs it, any areas that I think, you know, whether it needs chipping or I want to add additional fluid stains or anything like that. I've got some stowage and things like that I've already painted ahead of time, and I'm gonna set it on there. I don't know that I'm gonna glue it on. I want to see how it looks, because I started off thinking I wanted to have the stowage all over it, but I'm kind of liking the way it looks more clean. Not clean as in no weathering, but clean as in not a lot of stowage on it. So I may just see how that looks, and I think that'll be about time to wrap the video up. Well, I think I'm going to call this one done. What a fun kit this is. I can't say enough about what a great kit this is. There's just so many just positive points to it. All of the variations that you can add to it. The details, the number of details that are on it. The amount of stuff that I could have actually magnetized. I only did a little. I just did these main guns, but you could magnetize this element here, the gun here. There's different things that can be put here. You could magnetize that. If I would have been really thinking ahead, I would have put magnets underneath these fenders so that I could magnetize all the stowage and just stick it on as I want. Right now, those are just set in place. I haven't decided if I'm going to glue them on or leave them separate so that whoever the eventual owner is can decide if they want them on there. But this is just such a fun kit. I'll probably put a matte coat on it. I'm still letting a few things dry. But besides that, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope this and the other videos in this series have been helpful and that they've provided some kind of enjoyment or encouragement in some way. If nothing else, maybe they've been the catalyst for a good nap. So if that's what we've accomplished, I'm glad for that too. So thank you for watching. I'd also like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon. If you're interested in supporting the work that I do here on this channel, there's a link down below to Patreon. There's also a link to subscribe. I'd be grateful if you would subscribe to the channel and give this video a like, and maybe leave a comment down below. I'd be most grateful for that. And with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.